about midway through, or at least over midway through their group's individual matches. We are still part of the group stage in this tournament, towards the tail end of it. Good number of races still to be had to close out the rest of the tournament here, and it looks like the runners just started here. It is worth mentioning that between these two runners, MT is running on PC and DaleDukk is running on PS4. So to sort of normalize the playing field here, both runners are going to be running in real time. However, in other matches, you have probably seen us use the auto splitter in combination with the loadless time. I'm just going to adjust the volume here.
Once you reach their anti-will attack formation, then destroy the Goliath-class unit by any means necessary, and gather what data you can. Understood.
So, this is on normal mode.
12H down. All units activate
at least in terms
mode
of
and rely on visuals
this
to
game,
evade.
it's a very sort of an interesting game overall. The beginning here, or the beginning couple minutes that we see in these flight units here doesn't really dictate too much of the coming gameplay, mostly because what we'll mostly be dealing with
Our
is
HO229
an 3D
cancelers are
environment,
ineffective.
although we will be seeing more of these flight unit sections in the future. Just sort of getting used to the controls here and avoiding some things.
Requesting permission to engage.
Permission granted.
So, a lot of these sort of top-down sections here are just a matter of clearing out all the enemies. So one thing you'll definitely notice here between these two runners is just them taking a little bit of damage that'll allow them to use up some of the recoveries that they have in their inventory. That'll just make for some quicker menuing in a couple minutes here when we face off against one of the first bosses. But at this moment you can kind of see the different perspective changes between sort of the top-down, sort of shoot-'em-up style thing in the flight unit, and now transitioning to sort of the twin-stick shooting. Of course, the game isn't always like this. This is mostly just because we're in the flight units. Once we do transition into the 3D aspect in a little bit here, we will see more of what this game has to offer, but it doesn't really take away that much from the gameplay, and it transitions quite smoothly between each of these.
And begin gathering data on the local terrain.
Understood.
Sorry about all the audio in this. But we are transitioning into sort of this factory area here. MT taking all the possible damage that he can. But a lot of these sections are sort of optimized in between trying to kill all of these little flyers as quickly as we can. MT showing off some good optimization here. But in a little bit here, once we crash through the door, essentially, we will be seeing both runners use a technique known as damage glitch, which is essentially when you have the second weapon set, your weapons are switched around such that you have the big sword on the light attack slot, and you have the small sword on the heavy attack slot. And it just so happens that when you perform a dash plus a heavy attack, a couple frames later, or rather 2B, ends up throwing out her sword and dealing about 4.5 times damage, which is pretty significant, and we will be taking advantage of that for a majority of this run here. MT transitioning very quickly into Marks 1 here. One of the first bosses in, or I guess you can consider him a boss. He is rather easy to take down though, and it's mostly just a pushover. However, MT not really getting a push there, getting a side swipe. A little bit of time loss on MT's part there. But essentially, he's just trying to get the boss down to a threshold, trigger the dialogue, and finish the dialogue as quickly as possible, to then progress. But you could really kind of see the damage output that we use from these damage glitches a lot. Whenever we face any sort of enemy, we want to be damage glitching, and we want to be taking advantage of our flashlight in taunting some of these enemies. Very quickly there you saw MT go up onto that bridge there. He didn't choose to shoot it down, and he actually used it to get to a different part of the prologue and continue on his merry way. You'll see DaleDukk do the same crane skip as MT shows off a little bit of a different technique here. He's going to hold his pod program ability so that way the world around him essentially slows down considerably. And that'll help him in clearing out some of these enemies more efficiently and trying to use that laser itself to actually take out multiple enemies. So coming up here, MT has, or both runners have, a pretty hefty high jump to take care of off of bridge skip here. It looks like MT is not going to get it on the first shot there. The key here is to maximize the amount of height that we get out of each of these abilities. So he's going to aim to delay his lift so that way he gets enough height off of that. And again, through the different light attacks and heavy attacks that you can do, you're able to actually scale that bridge and get across to the other side instead of having to run all the way around. Another out of bounds you see on MT's screen. Dale having a little bit of difficulty there on bridge.
Alert. Bulletproof apparatus detected on enemies. Close range combat.
Ooh, that laser was a little off for MT there, but it's still relatively clean. Those stubbies can always pose a bit of a problem there because, well, as most runners of this game do come to know, those stubbies are very annoying enemies to deal with, and can definitely screw up runs left and right. Dale performing the same out of bounds we had just seen with MT. Very sort of convenient how you could just traverse this sort of lava area without even having to go onto any of the catwalks. But overall, very efficient clearing from MT here. We'll see if he goes for a little bit of swag on these stairs.
I surveyed the entire factory, but couldn't find anything.
Unfortunately, he takes a little bit of a safer route.
I don't know, moved it somewhere?
It is a little bit swaggy to go on top of the Engels machine there that we just passed through, because for some reason the devs did not include a height ceiling
There should be
where the
another
Engels
facility
machine
across that
exists.
bridge. It's a bit of a hike, but should we check it out? It's not like Command to get a location wrong. I guess even they get bad intel from time
Dale
to
using
time,
his
huh?
lasers in a little bit of an interesting situation there, but it looks like he's still going to have to pan out quite easily there. He does have to be careful on some of his health because especially these stubbies here can kind of catch you off guard given the perspective of just being top down. MT aiming to, well, and it looks like he's going to use a little bit of slow-mo on Marks 2 here just to slow down the animations there, and it just barely looks like he got the threshold for Marks 2. That, it looks like he was a little bit late to damage Marks 2 there, so he had to use that slow-mo to slow down the animations of the boss. But it did he did manage to pull it through, which was nice. Moving on to Engels. Most of the dense parts of Prologue that we had just seen are behind us now. Prologue is definitely one of the more intricate sections of the run just because of how close it is to the beginning, so it's difficult to practice as like a segment outside of actual runs themselves, which is always sort of a daunting task, especially for newer runners. Practicing Prologue can definitely has a definitely high skill ceiling, and you'll see some very small differences between these two runners that we have today. It looks like Dale is having a little bit of trouble on Marks 2 there. It's really easy to actually mess up that fight and have Marks 2 trigger another attack out of him. And on MT screen, you can really see sort of the perks of using the pod program to slow down time there. Extending the amount of time that we have to damage the Engels boss down is very handy. And it looks like MT got a clap attack. Not bad RNG, but still relative RNG. A small little time loss there when attacking Engels' hands there. Surprisingly, what many people actually don't really know is when you do actually attack a machine or boss or anything, mostly on bosses you'll notice this, that when you actually do attack, their animations do end up slowing down. And that can really sort of be a detriment in a section like this, where we're honestly just waiting for Engels to move and just go through the motions of striking down the bridge that MT has totally escaped. I see MT has chosen the left pipe. Left pipe is definitely, in my biased opinion, the best pipe. And there's no one here to disagree with me, ha 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 ha!
Hacking in.
So now that Engels is finished with his smacking of the bridge, MT is going to do a little bit of a intricate technique here on the steps there. He's going to do one lift and a second lift. That's caused by a technique that we call, conveniently, a double lift, where if you do a single lift into sort of a sloped mesh, you're actually sort of refreshing your lift capability, and you're able to perform a secondary lift after doing the first lift that enables you to get a good amount of height that you otherwise wouldn't be able to get. And we'll see that happen a couple times during this as well. I think maybe once or twice more if MT opts to go for these strategies here. Dale just finishing Engels moving around there. I didn't quite see what RNG Dale got there, but it looks like he wasn't put too far behind.
It talks? I didn't know the machines had that.
So on MT screen, he's really just trying to wait for the dialogue of Engels to finish here, and for Engels' attacks and the conversation that 2B and 9S are having to basically happen simultaneously, so that way as soon as the conversation between the characters ends and Engels finishes off one of his attacks, that'll be the RNG that he's going to look for. And it looks like he got relatively decent RNG there, losing maybe 5 seconds or so. But still, overall, pretty good. Shaping out to be a very good prologue for MT here. Very respectable RNG in this prologue here.
See this control system.
Affirmative. Infiltrating enemy subunit.
And MT on DaleDukk's screen, you can kind of see the different attacks that Engels can give between the different punches and missiles. Missiles surprisingly being one of the slower attacks that sometimes can just troll the runner. And it looks like MT was a little bit behind. I believe that's his PB that he's comparing to, so, but still, sub 15, real time, prologue, still pretty respectable.
Nothing for... I...
So miraculously, MT is back up into the bunker. He's just gonna do a little bit of setup in the bunker itself, which is kind of silly because the game actually forces you to go through some of the setup here. You'll see, but in terms of setting up brightness and voice volumes, it's actually quite easy to sort of mess up. Sometimes if you don't set your screen brightness or voice volume to correctly, then you'll either end up with a very quiet run or a very loud run, all depending on your own audio system, but it's always amusing how sometimes, even personally, I mess that up. Really loud voices is not so much fun to listen to for the entire run.
No, stop.
Huh?
I'm not too certain on what Dale's performance in his previous PB was, but I'm fairly certain that was a decent prologue in terms of, or in comparison to Dale's PB there. You'll see a quick dialogue skip there from MT just in front of those transporters. We'll see more of those dialogue cancels.
That means we'll be getting
It was a little bit late to catch that, but
Usually we
it's
can't get
essentially
any
a technique that we use
Way too
for
expensive
talking
for
with
us
our
robots.
partner
Too bad they can't mass
and
produce these things
walking
yet.
into
The
a
header's up
dialogue
ahead.
tree.
Let's
That'll allow us to essentially skip over the dialogue all in one shot without actually having to listen to it. Which is very handy and convenient in many, many places. We won't see too many dialogue skips in this ending run, but between some of the longer categories, they're certainly much more valuable. So now that MT is back into the flight unit, going down to the city ruins, it's just a matter of clearing up some of them as fast as possible between the different waves. And he's sort of standing in different positions there to deal with the oncoming waves. Positioning, at least in these shmups, is somewhat important because they can, or at least the flyers can really kind of creep up on the player and catch you off guard if you're not careful. Like right there, MT got hit a couple times there, but it still looked like pretty good execution there. He's a little bit slow on those melee attacks there, going on to those fidget spinners, but fortunate, good RNG on both of those enemies there.
Sorry for the trouble, but we can't risk the enemy discovering their position.
Understood.
Good luck down there.
You'll see on DaleDukk's screen there very quickly he was doing something known as dash swinging for his movement. We'll see that a little bit later from MT, but at least on DaleDukk's screen, the technique that he's using, we will be using for a majority of the run in terms of movement. The reason why MT is not opting to do sort of the dash swing movement is because, at least as far as we know, on a level 1 short sword, when doing that attack itself is a little bit slower than what we would want out of some of our movement, so dash punching, as we see on MT's screen, is a little bit faster in that respect.
It's pretty weird.
Very cool. Jump reset there off of the little rampart there, going into the resistance camp.
So this is the resistance camp, huh? We should probably go talk to their leader first thing.
Well, please.
So now it's just surprisingly the devs actually made an interesting design choice here in that both of these quests that we have to do in the city ruins here is really just two fetch quests. One of them being completely, I guess staged would be the right word. Staged? No.
Too bad vegetation.
Either way,
most of it now.
just completely placed in the map, so we don't really have to deal with any sort of RNG, although it is worth mentioning that the other quest is not RNG, it's just a matter of where those enemies actually get placed in the field itself. And we'll see that in a little bit on MT's screen here, but he's making good use of that slow-mo, so that way these medium bipeds don't really bother him all that much between their large axe attacks.
Let's get these back to the trader. Plant life has claimed most of the central area. Big plants, too.
Report. Records show that vegetation has...
So as we're doing this dance around in the city ruins,
Wonder if there are any
we are
huge
basically
ores
getting
and
the
such, too.
materials for the level 2 sword, so that way we can basically upgrade that sword for free. With the completion of these quests that both runners are going to be doing, the game actually just gives you the upgrade materials for that upgrade, so we're going to take that as soon as we can. At least the base damage increase on that upgrade itself is 100% worth it.
The Resistance is a valuable ally.
Free
to
damage
Europe.
is
By
always
helping
welcome.
them, we also help ourselves. So no.
And
I
we'll
don't
definitely
think
be
they're
needing
a
it
pain.
on some of these
Yeah,
fights
yeah.
as well, between, at least on Adam and some of the other smaller target bosses are very annoying when you don't get a chance to lay that much damage on them. To be conveniently jumping for joy as MT going ham on that mashing for some of these dialogue blocks, or dialogue boxes, I should say. It's always very funny to see runners do that because you just know that they're in the mindset of mashing fast. So very similar routing between these two runners here, MT also opting to go through the center of the city ruins here, now using the level 2 sword for dash swinging, which is marginally faster than dash swinging with a level 1 sword. So jumping over that barricade and sort of turning his camera off into different directions. MT is trying to make it so that way 2B continues in her straight line away from the enemies that sort of spawn around the map. That makes it so that way 2B, because of the auto lock-on feature in this game, which is very handy in other difficulties and in other situations, but at least for the movement parts that we do here, the enemy spawns around the map don't really lend us any sort of help. So, good camera placement and good avoidance of some of those enemies in the areas is going to be key for saving the maximum amount of time. Here, MT is just going to pick up a few items between recoveries, damage buffs, and a couple of animal baits, and a chip known as Resilience. That chip's going to help him out later on, but it'll essentially make it so that way he can't stagger, as long as his health is full. Here, very quickly MT is going to clip out of bounds, up against that transporter. Very sort of unique out of bounds, and very easy to do, surprisingly. And completely overthought by the developers, or maybe it was intended. Maybe we'll never know. Very sort of clean movement there from MT. DaleDukk also upgrading VC to level 2, making his way out of Resistance Camp towards the desert.
There's gotta be an easier way.
Very safe play there from MT. He clipped out of the map on that barricade there, and he opted to go back in bounds to actually hit the discovery trigger here. Most runners would actually stay out of bounds to avoid this cutscene that MT just hit, in order to get a better sort of movement around the outside
This sand
of
sure
that
is slippery.
tunnel there, but it is going along the out of bounds area there is sort of risky depending on how much the player knows how to skirt around in the out of bounds, because at least the floor in that area is very, very small.
Careful.
So MT is going to diverge from the B line here by just a little bit, because he definitely wants to be picking up the pod C there out in the desert, so that way he can get an extra use out of his laser. And he's going to make good use of these hills in this desert area, so that way he can sand slide for a good amount of time, which we feel is much, much faster than just dash swinging. And it's just cool. Like, who doesn't want to sand slide in the desert? Very good
It's heading for that rocky
use of
area.
Don Burrows there, as we call him. This machine that MT was hoping for good RNG out of there as he slid along the rocks was very nice to him.
What's that?
Dale going around the outside of the desert area, going through the main area. Of course, all of these tricks in this game are technically optional. None of the tricks that we do in this are required. I guess you can consider that damage glitches required because of the amount of damage that it outputs, but in terms of the skips and the tricks, technically none of them are required. Although they do save a good amount of time. I'm looking at you, Litz. Moon to us. But we'll see here, MT in the desert housing area, or rather outside the desert housing area, I should say, as he skirts around on some of this out of bounds here. He was using that apartment building essentially to clip out of the area here, and now that he's in this sort of mess here, he's going to aim to grab that trigger out in sort of the void. Very nice execution there, doing a voidless strategy for desert housing, landing on the platform. Very quickly there, he's going to buff up in the menus and switch his first weapon set off, so that way he's able to use his first weapon set and second weapon sets for damage glitching. Surprisingly, you can do a damage glitch, swap your weapon set, and throw another damage glitch with both swords spinning, dealing the 4.5 times damage, which is very, very handy for increasing our DPS in some of these fights. And we'll see how well MT uses it. It's definitely a bit of an art to use it, but once it works, it's magical how fast some of these bosses go down. We'll see if Dale gets a good Don Burrows, and it looks like he does, which is very handy. It puts him a little bit closer to the cutscene trigger that he would otherwise be if he had just waited for the bot to burrow into the sand, hence why we call him Don Burrows, because he's just mean. And he's essentially just trying to kill as many of these machines here, and you'll see him use... Ooh, and it looks like he got hit right at the last second. He's going to try to self-destruct there to kill off as many of those machines as he could, but it didn't look like he got it out there. Once he's onto Adam here, he's going to try to buff up and taunt him, and it looks like he has a good setup here to skip this phase. We'll see if he can get it with a well-placed damage glitch and good timing. Oh, that's going to cost him a good couple seconds. Unfortunate, because that section is very sort of unique, and sort of the placement of your damage glitches are very important in order to get the maximum amount of damage that you need in order to just skip that phase. It's relatively precise, at least in terms of the damage output that you need. You'll see on Dale's screen here, he's going to aim to go for the trigger, and it looks like he's going to void out, which is a very respectable strategy. at least in terms of learning this out of bounds, it's very sort of unique. And it looks like he's going to switch off to double damage exploit here before going down to the platforms there. MT with a very clean, oh no, with a relatively clean Adam. And Dale's a little bit out of luck there. I don't quite know when Dale's last save was out in the desert camp, and it looks like he's going to take that save. That's going to set Dale back a couple minutes. Very unfortunate for Dale there. It looks like he missed one of his jumps trying to land onto the platform and wasn't able to, or rather didn't know some of the recovery strategies to get out of that pit there. And it looks like he's just going to take the load time and run all the way back along the same path there. So very unfortunate, but it is just some of the things that do happen in that part. An MT not having much luck either, trying to clip through that box and into the rock to get out of bounds there is sort of tricky because of the angle that you need and the timing that you need.
9S to bunker. Do you copy?
I read you, 9S.
Otherwise, MT would have skipped the trigger for this dialogue that he's running through right now, and he would have been able to take advantage of the save point that he had acquired earlier in order to basically save the game, reload the game, and displace 2B to a farther position through the save point without actually costing that much time.
Maybe we should.
No.
Roger.
So unfortunate for Dale for having to essentially go through these parts again. Unfortunately, the game does not save any of his progress between these sections here. He is going to have to go back and pick up Pod C, and he's going to have to go back through Desert Housing Skip again. It is rather common for runners to actually do that, because at least falling into Adam Pit isn't exactly what we want to happen. However, as I had mentioned earlier, there are actually recovery strategies that you can use to get yourself out of there. Between some of the fallen over buildings, it is possible to escape that quote-unquote soft lock. However, if you aren't familiar with some of the strategies there, then it is a little difficult to figure out in a pinch.
So why would machines try to look like us?
MT making his way out to the amusement park here.
I suppose.
Climbing up the sewer there relatively efficiently. Making good use of his dismount for the ladder. And he's going to... And it looks like MT went into the discovery cutscene for the amusement park there, lost a couple seconds because of having to skip that cutscene and be repositioned out to the middle of the street there, but given the circumstances, he wasn't able to double lift over the trigger itself. Right now, MT is going to try to go out of bounds here and traverse some of the amusement park area. Very lucky there. It looked like he didn't have enough height, and it looks like MT is just going to go for the safer route here in... I don't quite know if that got the trigger or not here, MT. You're scaring me, bud.
If they aren't hostile.
So the reason why he dipped into that little corner there was to pick up a trigger that he needs.
What's this?
Okay, looks like MT got the trigger when he was out of bounds there. Very lucky indeed. Dale, unfortunately, taking the longer way around, hitting some of these cutscenes. You can really see some of the time save that Desert Housing Skip gets when it comes to skipping some of these mini cutscenes in and around the map.
Yes.
People who know me well usually call me Nine.
MT taking the amusement park ride here on his way to one of the better bosses in this game. Definitely casually Beauvoir, the fight that we'll see in the theater. is definitely one of the more interesting bosses I find in this game. Between her phases that we get to see more so in a casual run. However, in the speedrun, we don't actually get to see very many of her attacks nor phases. However, that does not detract from the casual aspect of this at all. Overall, this game is actually quite fun casually, both in terms of a casual playthrough and in terms of the speedrun. Very enjoyable, I do have to say. Dale having a little bit of trouble there trying to get onto the platform, but it looks like
What the hell?
he's going to be starting up Adam Pit there. He might have to actually switch off his weapon set just to be 100% certain. MT making good use of double damage exploit there to take down Beauvoir's first phase. Very quick on some of those attacks there. It is rather easy to mess up that cycle because if you're too slow to damage glitch her, she ends up doing or getting too far away from the stage in a timely fashion. So
if we take hacking damage, it'll affect our bodies as well.
Unfortunately, the more attacks that she ends up doing, the more time that you'll end up losing. But MT making some very quick kills overall. In this body section here, he's really just trying to be careful in not getting hit by any of these Crucifix's attacks, because, at least for the time being, we'll see in A ending that, at least in terms of the minigame, it does cost us a little bit of time to be going into this hacking phase, but it looks like MT avoiding some of those attacks there very cleanly. And having very good damage glitches as well, going into more of Beauvoir's thresholding here. So once MT finishes off the boss, he's going to self-destruct, and he's going to need that for for a different technique we'll see in a little bit. Dale starting off on Adam there. It looks like he wasn't able to get the sword dodge skip.
That machine had some pretty weird things to say, huh?
Costing him a little bit more time in addition to what he's lost already. Unfortunate, but as I had mentioned earlier, some of the damage that he needed for that threat, or for that phase skip, as we should say, is definitely a little more precise, as we had seen from both runners now. Sort of an interesting technique that we had just seen from Dale there, where he was holding one of his pod programs and he charged it up to a 2 charge, so that way his pod program, or his current pod and his reserve pod, both fired a laser. But funnily enough, you can actually switch off to your alternate pod after doing that double laser and fire off a 3rd laser.
So why don't the machines?
However, that exploit is really only usable with the first and third pods, pod A and C. For whatever reason it works, and we actually have no idea why it works, surprisingly. MT making his way out to Pascal's village here. He's really got to be careful here, because sometimes you can actually kill Pascal, and because he is a quest giver, he only has 1 HP, and you can actually kill him, unfortunately. We have seen that from a couple different runners, myself included, in the past, and it is very easy to kill Pascal if you're not careful, although MT being a little interesting on those usages of those volt salves there. Sort of took away from his dash swinging ability, rounding that corner out of the village, but Either way, as long as they're out of his inventory, the faster his menuing will be, because he won't have to bother about those items in his inventory at all. So once MT's clipped through that fence there, he's going to be searching for a boar, hoping to do a little bit of swag here. Oh no, it looks like the boar missed! Okay, but it looks like he's still going to get a boar, just facing the wrong way. Unfortunate that that cost him a little bit of time. And it looks like he's going to do a little more boar hopping. Boar hopping is marginally faster than the boar's sprint, but it is faster nonetheless.
You leaving would be bad for me.
Mostly due to its ability to hop very quickly uphill, but we'll see that as MT climbs the hill to the resistance camp. And it looked like Dale didn't go for the save load either. So both runners unable to clip out of bounds as they left Atom 1 there in the desert. Some of that dialogue can actually be skipped by going out of bounds, but that's neither here nor there. Unfortunate time loss from both runners. Having to run on foot is marginally slower than having to save load.
He just started transmitting to us directly.
Now do you believe we're not a threat?
But you still don't have a heart.
So MT taking an intentional death there on the boar itself. Because he was on 1 HP, he was able to talk to Pascal in his village and take the required item to an enemy in the resistance camp. But because he had saved in Pascal's village, once he dies, he instantly gets teleported to the Pascal's village. And funny enough, his quest progress remains the same. So he's able to talk again to Pascal, deliver the item that his dead body had picked up from an enemy, and continue the quest. It definitely saves a trip back to Pascal's village and definitely makes it a lot easier in traversing the map area.
A Goliath? This was a trap. I knew it.
I promise you, we were not aware of this information.
2B, Command is deploying new flight units for us.
DaleDukk attempting to clip out of the amusement park area, and very clean clip out there. However, it did take him 2 tries in attempting that. Oh, and it looks like he clipped right back in bounds there. He did need to be a little bit careful on some of that because of the way that the buildings are lined up. It is sort of tricky in manipulating and navigating that out of bounds area, especially with his camera position there. It looked as if the floor he was landing on was out of bounds, when in fact it was back in bounds. Unfortunate.
The flight units should be on the roof of that building up ahead. It'll be dangerous, but we're not going anywhere unless we pass through that Goliath's legs.
But MT making for a straight beeline towards his next objective. Surprisingly, this Engels fight that MT is coming up to here is not actually required at all. What he's going to try to do is actually hop through a hole that exists in the invisible wall on his left as he enters the arena. That's going to make it so that way he can clip through that wall and instantly get into the flight units. However, there is a backup strat if you don't get it immediately, because it's very nice. Because it's very timing based on when Engels actually smashes through the building. That invisible wall actually ends up getting blocked off. However, the invisible wall itself doesn't actually go high enough. So, very clean clip out there by MT, escaping the first City Engels fight. However, the only required kill here is the second Engels, so he's going to take advantage of both of his pod programs to maximize the amount of damage that he can output and take care of the second Engels very, very quickly. So Dale making his way into the Beauvoir fight here. MT a good couple sections ahead of Dale at this point. MT making his way out to negotiations. Surprisingly, this dialogue that Commander is talking to 2B about here can be skipped in sort of a unique way that has an interesting interaction with the rest of the run, in that once you cancel that Commander dialogue that we had just been listening to with the dialogue that we just encountered as soon as we entered this cave, an interesting phenomenon happens in that the unique sort of ringing of the phone once an NPC or a quest giver phones the player, that ringing actually doesn't happen anymore. It's surprisingly how that happens in the game, because you can actually just trigger that even if you were just on a casual save going from point A to point B quickly.
The aliens you seek are no longer here.
But
they were wiped out.
That is going to save a good amount of time in this run, and we will be saving more time the longer and more phone calls that we actually get, like we do in some of the longer categories as well. However, just for strictly A ending, we're only going to be experiencing some of that time save because of sort of the shorter nature of this run itself. Now, Dale not getting exceptionally lucky here on some of these attacks against these crucifixes. He was hacked twice there, and each of these individual hacks will cost him a good amount of time. And it looks like he's going in for the third hack. Unfortunate overall.
Because they are an enigma. They killed uncountable.
He's going to be looking to damage down the rest of these bodies here.
Don't you think?
Having a little bit of a rough fight there from Dale in Beauvoir. MT making good use of that high jump there to escape the negotiations fight. We're having a little bit of a rough time trying to get the second part of that out of bounds, but still made it out in time. He was able to kill Eve in a significantly fast amount of time, or a very fast amount of time, because of the double damage exploit that he's using, and he was able to escape this room, or the arena rather, and using a very precarious high jump, he was able to escape the arena and go over its wall. Surprisingly, that wall does not actually go to the ceiling, unlike what it looks like. The invisible wall itself just goes up only so high, but through some genius ingenuity, Marky was able to find a way over it.
Back this way again? What a pain.
So,
Stop complaining.
praise be Marky.
2B, this is Operator 60.
Marky, as some of you might or might not know, is our resident glitch hunter who has found a good majority of the skips in this game. However, that's not to say that nobody else has found anything else. A good amount of people have put hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours into this game to find some of the stuff that we use today, and is very sort of special. Optimizations here and there are definitely nice to find, and even large skips themselves are nice to find as well. MT transporting back up to the bunker here, just to quickly talk to Commander, but he'll be making his way out to Pascal's village in a little bit to go on to A2 here. It looks like Dale's in a relatively good position here as well. He's on 1 HP because he had self-destructed at the end of the Beauvoir fight.
And now we have to go back to the city road.
That's going to allow him to do the same death warp that we had seen MT do.
It's been a while.
I'll rest if I feel like it.
And the reason why being on 1 HP is useful is because if we were on full HP, then at least attacking the animals or attacking some of the machines outside of the resistance camp, they actually take a couple hits to actually kill you, so being on 1 HP definitely makes that process faster overall. And self-destructing in the end of the Beauvoir fight definitely saved some time overall because of not having to worry about
Where is?
some of the time that it takes for them to kill you. Now MT making his way out to Pascal's village here, and he's gonna do a couple buys here and a couple sells. He's gonna sell some of his old buffs, so that way he can just fill up some of his inventory. He's gonna sell some system chips and some of those machine cores that he had picked up from the other bosses. That'll give him enough cash and enough space for hopefully some critical chips. I didn't quite see what his inventory had overall. I think it looked like MT opted for no defensive buffs there, although it looks like he'll be equipping his chips a little bit later. Very quick there on MT's screen, he skipped over one of the side quest cutscenes that exists in that sort of path outside of Pascal's village. Very good use of a double lift over the top of that trigger cutscene. It's rather tricky to get because of the distance and height that you need in order to get over that trigger. However, it is rather nice to get.
This must be the commercial
overall.
structure Pascal was talking about. The records say it was once a facility known as a shopping center.
So almost simultaneously, both players doing a dialogue skip there. DaleDukk going up against that door and talking to the door to cancel 6-0's dialogue, and MT walking into a dialogue trigger when he was talking to 9S. Both very handy techniques in making some of these sections go a little faster instead of having to wait around for dialogue to happen. Making short work of these medium bipeds here. And we'll see what MT equips in terms of his chipset. He's going to aim to equip resilience and a good number of these critical up chips, and it looks like he's going to fit 2 crit plus 1s. That's a good amount of crit chance that he has at this moment. It is worth mentioning, though, that the way that criticals work in this game, because this is sort of an RPG, having these critical chips in your chipset enable you to deal on a % chance. I forget what exactly the multiplier is, but it's a pretty ridiculous multiplier for damage to essentially deal, I think it's like 500, in the realm of like 500% or 500 times damage on a tick of damage, which is pretty crazy. It's pretty bonkers when some of those criticals happen. Dale making his way out to the city ruins to fight city angles.
What is with these
And it looks like he's going to be
Don't listen to what they're
aiming
saying, 2B.
for... I take that back. Dale making his way out to city ruins. Unfortunately, it looked like he was about to go for a strategy that I would have gone for on the PS4. However, Dale taking the risk in wanting to do mum skip a little bit later and not taking the transporter. Very quickly here, we're going to see MT go for a long jump that's essentially going to skip over a older technique that we would have used, and they didn't get enough height there. Oof. And I guess we'll see both techniques here. So the technique that we had just seen MT try to do is what this skip accomplishes, and in that doing that precise long jump would otherwise make it so that way he can just go from the mainland onto the hill that the castle sits on. However, the technique that he had just done was to basically slide along the top of the hill and enter a drown warp that puts him back up onto the drawbridge, fooling the game into thinking that he was actually inside the castle, even though he wasn't, making very short work of these windows here out of bounds in Castle Skip, and DaleDukk also getting what looked like the recovery strat in City Angles. Going over that top of the wall is definitely going to prove useful for DaleDukk. Skipping over that first fight is very, very handy, because skipping the first Angles fight can definitely save a good couple minutes, because that fight is just awful, believe me.
type android.
Alert.
Speaking of awful fights, MT going into A2.
But why?
I really hate this fight because it's in a 2D's perspective, although most people actually do like it.
Bunker to 2B and
But
9S. We've picked up a
the
signal
trick
from a
that
black
MT
box
is trying to do is
located
essentially
known
to
as
stun
A2.
lock A2, so that way he can put as much damage as possible onto her, using to the best of his abilities these damage glitches, and getting an overall quick fight, in my opinion. That fight can definitely be a little bit faster because of how A2 chooses her attacks are just completely random as far as we know, and can definitely take a good amount of time when she dashes across the screen, and sometimes you know where she's going to end up, and other times you just don't know where she's going to end up. Very quickly there, we'd also seen MT skip over the escape of that arena. So once you defeat A2, you can actually just go and otherwise, in a casual save, you would have to jump out the window and follow A2. However, in doing so, you trigger like a 5-minute or so dialogue sequence, and unfortunately, that's not as fast as just escaping the back of the arena. So that's what we do. We just escape the back of the arena and completely nope out of that really long dialogue sequence. Dale entering the negotiations fight between Alan and Steve, and 2B and 9S here. Again, aiming to just damage down Eve as fast as possible, and I'm not too certain if Dale's gonna go for the escape here. We might not. I'm not too certain on how Dale is comfortable with this fight. It looks like he's going to take some of these offensive buffs
It's not recommended to interface with machines
in order
without
to speed up
consulting
his
command.
kill a little faster there. MT dipping into the jukebox area to skip some of that dialogue, which is very crucial, as I had mentioned before, in sort of speeding up some of these sections, because otherwise having to wait around for dialogue is just not what we want to be doing. Making use of that box there close to an enemy, he's going to clip out of the resistance camp area and essentially enter the flooded city. And he's going to do that double plunge there and grab the discovery cutscene at the entrance of the flooded city. Is going to fall down to the bottom of the map. That replaces him back up at the resistance camp, and he's able to then plunge down to the final part of the flooded city and kill these machines that he needs in order to progress the quest. Very, very handy and very, very useful out of bounds, because it kind of showcases how close and how closely knitted some of these areas are. Oh, interesting here. That's a very interesting sort of phenomenon. So, on DaleDukk's screen here, he managed to actually clip out of bounds, but it can actually happen that Eve, sometimes he stays within the confines of the arena, but other times Eve actually follows you out of bounds. We don't quite know why this works like this, but most cases, Eve actually doesn't follow you out of bounds, and you're able to escape the arena. Very sort of interesting find there, or very interesting showcase from Dale. Completely unexpected. MT carving his way through these machines here, now entering the sleeping accommodation section of the run. Although I guess fortunately, however unfortunately, both runners are going to be at different points of the run here, allowing me to talk about something as MT makes his way through the Valley of Shadows, through Grune. Unfortunately, there's not too much to talk about as MT goes through this flight unit section for the next, I'd say 8 minutes or so. Although fortunately, that allows me to focus and get a good amount of love onto Dale here. Dale making his way through the bunker, and it's looks like he didn't quite get the dialogue there. Trying to get the dialogue skip up at the top of that elevator, as I believe we had seen MT do, is a little tricky, mostly because of the size of the dialogue trigger is sort of unproportional to how big the, in comparison to how big the hallway is. It sort of bubbles out at the end in sort of a semicircle. However, Dale making his way out to the Pascal's Village area in order to pick up some of his buys. And he'll be needing those as he goes into A2 here. I believe Dale picks up defensive buffs in addition to some of the other buys. Definitely a little bit of a safer move, in my opinion. However, as MT is shown, strictly going for offensive buffs might be the better option. And we'll see what Dale ends up choosing here. Again, we're going to see Dale sell some of these materials here, picking up more recoveries and picking up some of these buffs here. Looks like he is going to go for defensive buffs, which is a very smart play overall. A lot of these situations do put you in sort of precarious places that on low HP can really kind of scare most players. And we're going to see here Dale also sticking in some of these chips here. I didn't quite see what those chips were, but it doesn't look like he has enough space. I don't quite know if he... It doesn't look like he's going to be selling those system chips there, so it's going to be a little bit of a overall time loss in trying to equip some of those offensive chips. Rather unfortunate, I didn't quite see what some of those chips were. Although it did look like he had some of those crits, some of those juicy crits that we want. MT making his way into the full throttle part of Grune, making his way through some of this auto-scroller is really just kind of a matter of wills.
Close range attacks with EMP blasts. We've got to find another way to damage it.
And again, because it mostly is on rails and is scripted, it's mostly just waiting for a good majority of this part for MT here. Just making his way through the auto-scroller section. We're probably going to see for Dale a dialogue skip here. We'll see if he goes for it otherwise. Oof, and it looks like he was a little bit too far on the trigger. I've never seen most people go towards the right end of that dialogue there, but it looked like he had triggered it right at the very end there when he wanted to attempt to skip the dialogue, but you could definitely see some of this time adding up against Dale here. Showing off some of this slow-mo capability from Dale. Very swaggy in terms of dealing with these machines here. I guess one of the techniques that I didn't really mention that we had, I guess now at both, from both of these runners is use a technique known as double damage exploit plus slow-mo, which is rather sort of an interesting technique because of the nature of how when you're slow-moing or holding down a pod program ability, you aren't able to weapon swap. So an interesting technique that players have come up with is sort of rotating between throwing a damage glitch and weapon swapping, and between cycling your slow-mo ability from holding pod fire or pressing pod fire and holding pod program. Obviously this will make a lot more sense when I believe MT does it towards the end of his run. However, explaining it is really a lot more sounds a lot more complicated than what it actually looks like. Dale making his way across these rocks here, making his way out to the castle. I'm not too certain if Dale goes for the long jump strategy we had seen earlier MT try, although I do have a feeling that Dale is going to go for the much more simplistic Mario Kart strategy, sliding along the hill. MT finishing off Core 1 here. You can short work of some of those waves. I'm not entirely certain if he had gotten Core RNG on some of those rotations, but switching over to Dale here, very clean Mario Kart. Sliding along those rocks is definitely a little bit of an interesting sort of movement in how sort of slippery the terrain is there. If you don't hold self-destruct at the right moment and continue holding self-destruct, you can definitely lose a little bit of time in terms of some of the placements, and it looks like he's going to have a little bit of difficulty here on these windows. These windows in the castle are surprisingly convenient in how they really just sort of are there in the out-of-bounds area. Very, very fortunate placement from the developers in putting and making those windows actually solid. Surprisingly, making the castle skip very, very easy in terms of scaling. In terms of scaling the castle area. Definitely one of my favorite areas in the game because of the complexity of the castle itself. It was very, very amusing to see it skipped in such a very simple manner. But Dale making his way into A2 here. We'll see how much A2 gives Dale in terms of an issue. It looks like he's not damage pushing as quickly as we had seen MT do. Between also not having as many offensive chips either. However, some of the damage glitch placements that... Oof, and it looks like Dale's getting hit a little bit more often than he needs to there. Going into critical health, not quite making sure of his buff status there. Very sort of risky on some of those hits there from Dale, but overall still respectable fight. It looks like Dale also got the back end escape out of the A2 arena.
Otherwise, they're just going to go off course.
Unfortunately, some of those machines that do spawn close to the transporter sort of spawn in weirdly as a result of that I guess you can consider it an out of bounds in some way. But they definitely spawn in a little bit strangely because of our actions in escaping the A2 fight, or the latter half of the A2 fight in escaping. So, sort of a weird interaction that we had seen there, but overall not that bad. MT making his way up to Core 2. And it looked like for a second that it was going to give him some bad RNG, but overall still pretty good. Making quick work of these 4 outside cores is going to prove beneficial for him. Making good use of those pod programs there in order to clear out some of the smaller cores before taking out the larger core itself. And we'll see Dale moving on into the resistance camp to perform some of the similar tricks that we had seen from MT a couple minutes ago. So Dale, just on the cusp of the Groon segment here, MT coming towards the end of it. Fortunately, as this section does take a good couple minutes to complete, and is basically just auto-scroller the entire way through, apart from the individual core fights, cores 1, 2, and 3. The rest of it is basically just on rails. We're also seeing from Dale, they're also dipping into the jukebox area, canceling dialogue, talking to an enemy, and clipping out of the back area of the resistance camp, aiming to plunge down the back end there towards the entrance to the flooded city, hitting the discovery cutscene, which is very nice. Again, we're going to see him void back up to the resistance camp there by basically not being on solid ground for a long enough period of time. And Dale being very conservative here because, at least on PS4, some of the loading areas here don't actually load that quickly in comparison to the PC version. But overall, still pretty good. Dale entering the fight between these machines that he needs to clear out. And very conveniently, MT clearing out Core 3, progressing through the rest of this. Definitely entering some of the faster-paced sections of the game here for MT. There's a good number of bosses and a good number of skips that he's going to need to execute in a relatively short period of time in this latter half. Right there that we had just seen from MT going into that drown zone isn't exactly quite precise, but it is sort of relevant because he is drowning in that specific location, so that way he can progress through the flooded city with minimal effort and more displacement from drowning in the wrong area, and essentially moving him forward through the flooded city with minimal effort. Dale taking out those machines there and going into the flight units, conveniently going into the Groon section. Unfortunately, there again is not going to be very much to talk about on Dale's screen here, as we had seen with MT. MT also coming up to a relatively precise clip here. He is going to be using keyboard and mouse there, so he did take a split second to switch focus between keyboard and controller. Keyboard, of course, you're able to hold the W or forward key and do specific heavy attacks on angles that he chooses, because at least trying to do precise angles on a joystick on controller is rather difficult, and definitely makes it a lot more consistent to be doing that on keyboard and mouse. So relatively clean copied city out of MT. However, it did take him a good couple tries in order to get through that. Very swaggy pod launch from MT
What is this?
into the copied city area. Shout out to Blue Metal for that one.
Crystallized silicon and carbon. Further,
What's with the corpses?
it is unlikely the Yorha units came this far on their own. Hypothesis. The enemy
So as MT makes his way into the Atom fight, there's going to be a couple things going on first. Here, he, at least in the first section of the Atom fight, he's going to aim to clip out of the fight of this arena, using a relatively precise high jump there into a plunge, and that's essentially going to allow him to get out of the arena and traverse back to the elevator that he came from and interact with that. The reason why we need that elevator is because there's a dialogue that exists on the inside of that elevator that triggers, and we're actually able to use that dialogue to skip one of the longer talking sections that Adam has. And that's going to save in the realm of about 50 seconds, if I remember correctly. Fortunately, MT losing basically 0 time on that dialogue skip. Because of the time that it takes for some players to clip out at the very beginning of that fight, it does depend on how much time you actually end up saving. However, MT making short work of that dialogue itself, and now transitioning into the fight. He does have to be relatively careful here of Adam, because when Adam is taunted, he is, I believe, without defense buffs, a 2-shot. Adam is very powerful, and he does need to be careful of some of his attacks if he's not careful. However, it should be a relatively easy fight for the likes of MT. Although it is worth mentioning that some of Adam's attacks in this final phase here do actually end up speeding up quite quickly. Sort of seeing the different kicks and moves that we see out of Adam there. Very clean overall. Very clean Adam fight out of MT there. Very quickly here, we're also going to see MT talk to the computer girl. He's going to dialogue cancel with her and go to Devila and Popola, getting a good number of dialogue skips all in one shot here. Very quick out of MT, opting to not pick up skill salves. I would actually say that's an interesting strategy there, because he's definitely going to need those skill salves for later on in the final sections of the fight. Although it isn't exactly that important, it is still doable without those skill salves. However, those skill salves, if he does make use of his lasers, is going to be pretty huge in terms of some of his damage output. So now that MT's read the mail from the commander, he's going to make his way out to the abandoned factory area.
No kidding. Apparently, they're seeking to form an alliance of some kind with our village.
If that's what they want, why don't they move in?
I believe they're working on building a colony of their own.
You don't say.
Indeed.
Dale making his way through Garoon here. Again, as I had mentioned before, for MT, when he was going through this section, it is a lot of auto-scroller on rails, scripted sections and waves between all the different parts of that individual fight and flight unit section. Making his way up to Core 1 is not exactly the most interesting thing to talk about either, unfortunately. MT making quick work of those staircases, very swaggy overall, using a double lift to truncate some of his walking and making good use of 2B swiping the camera away, although MT doesn't want to let up there. Swiping and swiping away, 2B will go. For some reason, whenever she actually does swipe the camera away in that animation, it is relatively faster than her individual slow walk. And, interesting, I'd never seen... Oh, that was a close save there by MT. I'd never seen someone dash out of that clip out there. I'd always seen someone do what's known as a heavy hold out of that little clip there. But MT is essentially just waiting the 18 seconds it takes for this priest mook to walk his little stubby legs over to the elevator. However, if MT did actually fall to the void out of bounds there, it actually would have reset his, or the priest's, position. forcing MT to waste a good amount of time between that. However, fortunately, MT saving that trick out of bounds and giving us a little bit of swag, showing that MT is willing to run the risk of losing time. Very swaggy in my books.
Hello.
The risk
Pascal.
is definitely
I'm
swaggy.
here to discuss the peace treaty.
So what's important about what this section that MT is going to be doing very quickly here, I believe MT goes and fights these enemies here. There is a strategy to actually clip out of this room so that way you don't have to fight these enemies. However, MT opting to kill these machines here in this area. And it looks like he had a very clean fight at that as well. He did get a couple counterattacks among those stubbies as they were armed. However, he didn't lose too much time. However, it is a little bit of a risk in doing so because sometimes those enemies don't actually group up all that well in some cases. So clipping out would have been probably a more consistent method of doing that. And now in this room in particular, MT's going to be trying to clip out. Very nice, their second try. Clip out of that room. That's essentially going to reset the elevator so that way he can go back up to the room that he just came from. Otherwise, this section doesn't allow you to go back up this elevator unless you void out, as we had seen with MT. Very precisely here, he's going to aim to clip out of this pipe. It's sort of an interesting plunge. If you go too far in one direction, you don't clip through in one direction, you actually do clip through. However, he's going to go and plunge all the way down to the deep factory area. And it looks like he didn't get it the first time, but he's going to aim and try to get one of these triggers that's right outside the door there. And on top of that, because he's falling for a long enough duration, he's actually able to trigger the void out so that way he respawns all the way back at this very high point in the deep factory. So he has the trigger that he needs, and all he needs to do is go back to that same out of bounds and plunge all the way down to the end of the deep factory section, closing out the deep factory.
Exit route secured.
Overall, I think that skip saves about a minute 30 or so. However, between some of the mess ups that we had seen in MT trying to fall down and respawn back up into that very high room, definitely wasted a little bit of time on his part, but overall still pretty good. Dale on Core 2 there, and it looks like Core 2 is giving him a little bit of an issue between some of those rotations. That's what I was alluding to earlier, and how sometimes it rotates in the wrong direction, actually wasting a good amount of time from the player as they fight that section of Groon. However, Dale on the home stretch out of Groon. We'll see how he does on the final core out of the three that we encounter in Groon. MT just basically hanging around, spinning around up on this bridge here, similar to how we had seen at the very beginning of the run. However, this bridge is a little unique in how there's a hanging spot that you can sort of hang out on at the very tippy top of that bridge there, and he's able to essentially hang out as we wait for the boss to begin and be vulnerable. Very quickly here, he's going to make sure the boss is taunted, and he's going to make sure that he's outputting as much damage as he can onto the boss, making good use of that flashlight spam in order to make sure the boss is taunted. Sometimes he actually doesn't quite taunt when he's doing all these inputs here. Very clean overall fight. He did get one attack out of Soshi, however, probably for the better overall, because Soshi sometimes doesn't give that good of attack there. And it looks like Dale, I don't know if that was a wrong turn from the core or not, but it looks like the core is going to be turning again. Unfortunately, Dale not killing that last core as quickly as he would have wanted to. And it looks like he's going to use both programs there to take out the final core, making Rune go down. MT basically leaving Deep Factory here as Dale makes his way through the flooded city. MT definitely making his way towards the end boss rush of the A ending. So getting very close to the end of the run for MT here. With just a couple bosses left ahead of him, very few skips left overall for MT. I'm not quite certain on how Dale compares to his current personal best, but definitely getting set back early on, as we had seen, did not really help him all that much. MT quickly using one of the pod spins there to navigate sort of that staircase area. One of the pod spins there surprisingly does waste a little bit of time in comparison to some of the different optimizations of going down those stairs, because it sort of zigzags from one end to the other with invisible walls basically everywhere. It's a little bit tricky to navigate that staircase. We'll see how DaleDukk goes on Copied City clip here in this pipe. Sort of an interesting angle. I've never quite seen someone use this angle before. But still just as precise between the two runners here. Dale, unfortunately, having a little bit of difficulty here. Not quite... It looks like he's changing his angle quite sporadically. Not having as much luck as MT had seen, but very nice. There we go. Both runners had a little bit of difficulty there on that trick in particular, which goes to show how precise it is, even for both PC and PS4.
Good luck.
However, it is worth noting that on Dale's screen, he did have to wait a significant margin of time because of the relatively slower PC load or PS4 loads in comparison to PC. MT making quick work of these machines in the back end of the burning resistance camp. Very clean fights. Nothing really spawning behind him, which is very fortunate. Very clean dispatch of that Goliath there. Very clean overall fight. So as MT makes his way out of the resistance camp, he's going to encounter one of the last couple bosses here. He has to be very careful on some of these attacks here. Bokushi is very relentless once he gets into some of those ranged attacks there. In combination with the electricity that surrounds MT during this fight, it is going to be kind of precarious for some of this damage here. He does end up actually breaking a leg, costing him a good amount of time as he waits for the boss to go into his final death throes. Oh my god! Very lucky from DaleDukk there. Almost going into the Copied City elevator from skipping the dialogue that encompasses mansplaining.
You okay?
That was certainly outside of my comfort zone. I would definitely not have gone that deep into the elevator. it does actually happen that sometimes if you do go too deep into that elevator, you can end up soft locking the game, depending on where you ended up saving. That would have set DaleDukk back a good couple minutes if he had gotten caught inside the elevator. MT making incredible work of Core 1 there. Pulling him up onto the hill definitely makes that section significantly faster because of the way that the hitbox works for that sort of mini-boss. I guess you can call it a boss. Given the amount of HP that that thing has, you can really sort of burst it down because it doesn't really have any other phases to it. So it's just a matter of getting that amount of damage onto the boss itself. Dale making good damage onto Adam there, sorry. Being careful of some of his attacks is definitely going to be relatively important, especially with defense buffs as well. You do have to be careful with some of Adam's attacks. MT making very short work of those fighters on the Pascal's fence. And it looks like MT's gonna try for the 0 cycle against Core 2. He does need to keep those damage glitches rolling, but it doesn't look like he got enough crits to finish off the boss. Very sort of interesting location. Where the hell is the Core? There it is, close to the fence, completely behind. I'm really surprised the Core got placed there. Anyway, what MT was trying to do was actually cause enough damage to that Core to basically just explode all in one phase. Otherwise, he had to wait for the Core to drop down and finish it off himself. Fortunately, the Core did not land anywhere sort of precariously, making quick work of that Core. However, because he had slow-mode, a definite amount of time was lost in attempting to try and damage it. MT getting grabbed on the opening parts of Eve. A little bit of time loss there because of him getting grabbed here, but he does need to make sure that he doesn't get hit too many times by Eve. Considering the amount of levels between us and Eve, he does need to be careful. He's on 2/3 HP, being very careful in not getting hit there. He probably would have actually died if he did get hit. But MT was a little bit late there on his double damage glitch slow-mo. Making sure he was buffed up there was probably a good choice, however he did do that a little bit too late. A technique there that we do actually use is by making sure that Eve does not reach 100% HP when he goes to heal up. You can actually slow his animations down and his healing down to actually make it so that way he just transitions into the next phase immediately. However, MT losing a little bit of time to that as well. He did get hit initially there, and you can sort of see the damage that the bullets that MT takes here from Eve deal so much damage to him, especially when Eve is taunted here. He does need to stay on top of his health as he ends up lasering Eve. This would have been a very good opportunity for him to take those skill salves because he's using a technique devised by the world record holder himself, Canaris, using these techniques that basically fling the player into the boss as he's flying around and slow-moing the boss so that way you can land a couple melee attacks, and once you're done with those melee attacks mid-air, you can release your lasers and deal an additional amount of damage to the boss himself in a very short period of time. However, it did take MT a couple attempts there, but still overall pretty good. He does need to be careful in his final phase, though, as he cleans up Eve. getting hit repeatedly is not exactly what he's going to be looking for, considering how Eve does his attacks. He is still moving around the arena relatively quickly as he cleans up this final fight, but it looks like Eve's being relatively nice here, not going too far away from him. Still overall a really good fight overall for MT. Very quickly here, we're going to see out of Dale clipping out of the deep factory area to fight all these mooks. The clip out there is rather precise, but not entirely precise, but it does make that fight a lot more consistent in terms of time, in terms of overall time as well. Calling in that elevator is going to be a little tricky considering the amount of enemies that are close by. Pascal not getting that RNG there, but overall, for MT, 134.58. I believe that's real time as well. Overall, relatively respectable run by MT. And we'll see here from DaleDukk attempting to clip out of the same room that we had seen from MT here. It doesn't look like he's getting enough height to close out that final clip there, but it looks like he's going to clip out. Fortunately, he did need to get a good amount of height in order to execute that pod launch in order to clip out. So, very quickly to mention here, Dale going into the deep factory skip for the second half of it. He's having a little bit of difficulty trying to clip out of this pipe here. However, he is trying to get the trigger that's down below him. Considering that he's up in this tall room, he does need to be careful in the way that he clips out. It looks like he's having a little bit of difficulty on these pipes. This is really what I was talking about in terms of actually clipping out here. The angle that he's looking for is a little bit too far right from what it looks like. He needs to be aiming a little bit more left. Otherwise, he's just going to continue sort of flopping down onto that pipe. But once he's out of bounds here, he's able to go all the way down to this bottom area. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to void back up, but that's okay. He still managed to traverse a good half of the deep factory area. However, he does need to be careful on these crushers. Coming up here. However, most runners probably do not know that there is actually a way to go above these crushers. However, Dale does need to be careful on the crushers and these exploding guys here as they fall from the sky. However, very good luck from from Dale, sorry. Trying to traverse that second set of crushers is always daunting and very scary indeed. So now that Dale is making his way into the Sochi fight, I'm gonna see if MT wants to hop in here. So overall, 134.58 from MT for A ending. I believe that is RTA, so in comparison to a loadless time, it would be a couple minutes faster in comparison. Let me go and
should be destroyed.
9S, that Goliath we just encountered.
I got it. I've been keeping an eye on you. I'm gonna shut
There
off
we
power
go.
to the factory now.
Do it.
Factory system.
So here we can really see in DaleDukk's perspective how sort of running around here as on the level of the boss, you still cause the boss to do some of his attacks, and in some circumstances they can be sort of annoying, especially for most runners. It is really just better to go ahead and hang out on one of the bridges,
Just shut down the electrical grid.
and
Enemy shield deactivated.
so once the boss is vulnerable here, Dale's really gotta be making sure that his damage glitches land here on the boss, and not getting hit by some of these attacks can really save a good amount of the damage output that he's going to need. And it looks like Dale's getting a good couple of attacks out of Sochi here. Ideally, the least number of attacks out of Sochi, the better, considering how long some of his animations are. It is better overall. But it looks like MT is in the voice call here.
Hey, how's it going, man?
Oh boy. But overall, a still pretty good run out of your MT. I know that's a little bit behind your PB, but I believe, I don't know what that came out in terms of liveless time. That would be closer to like, what, 131?
It was a
132?
it was a 133, like 02 or something.
Ah,
133.01. Just yeah, nothing like really terrible happened. Just solid like 20-second time losses on each segment. Adds up.
definitely, for sure. So Dale just making his way through the tail end of the Deep Factory here. Definitely, as we had seen again in the prologue section, that same out of bounds is used. Surprisingly, sort of comes full circle between the tricks that we use in A ending. Very sort of minor, but it is sort of funny how that happens.
Yeah, it's like slightly different though. You have to do the double jump so you don't target one of those robots.
Yeah, considering that they're right next to the lava, definitely makes it a little more interesting.
I'm heading back to the resistance camp.
It's pretty simple to forget to do the double jump there and just pod launch off the edge into the lava.
I see.
Definitely guilty of that. Is Dale ahead of his PB? Do you know?
Receiving.
I actually don't know. He did lose a good amount of time. I don't know if you had been watching or not, MT, but he did lose a good amount of time in the early game because of Atom Pit.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately having to reload the save definitely put him back a good couple minutes.
Okay.
So I'm not quite certain if he is keeping up with his PB, although it would be interesting to see him pull it through here, especially on these final phases. I'm not quite certain how that played out in his previous PBs, but he is kind of skirting close to it. If he's fast on these last couple sections, he might actually get a faster RTA time, I believe.
He has like a 52 or high 51.
5140. I believe a couple, or his most recent run was 46.
Loadless?
That should be real time.
Oh wow, okay.
So he is going to be a couple minutes behind his personal best, but that's to be expected given the circumstances in his early game. Although definitely making sure that some of those backup strategies, especially spending some time in that final fight for at least in the pit itself, definitely sort of pays off in terms of knowing where to go, especially if you end up falling into the pit for the Desert Discovery skip. But Dale making good work of those stubbies in the Burning Resistance camp, making his way into Bokushi here. He does have defense buffs, but he did not end up getting any of these offensive chips into his chip set, so he is going to be a little bit behind on his damage output, and he does need to be careful on some of these attacks here. Getting stuck in the electricity as he's perfect evading it can definitely cost him a good amount of time.
That projectile attack can be brutal.
Yeah, I do remember on your run, MT, where on numerous occasions you had gotten down to critical HP in front of Bokushi there, and I was really kind of scared there because you didn't have any defense buffs, and...
Nah, no buffs.
Yeah, I can definitely attest to that. Oh no! Oh no, and it looks like Dale got hit on one of those final explosions. It looks like he got two-tapped there from the final shockwave and the actual hit itself from Bokushi slamming onto the ground. That's really unfortunate because that's actually going to make him lose his resilience chip as he makes his way into the Bokushi fight again. We'll have to see if his body ends up doing something really derpy here, because sometimes...
Normally you have to wait, right? Until the fight's over.
I think you actually do have to wait until it's over, but sometimes you can sneak out and grab your body. It depends on where exactly his body is, but it looks like he's just going to go directly into the fight. I don't quite see it on the ground, so it might actually be running around in the background. I didn't quite get a chance to see it. Oh! It looks like he has it on the hill there. That's very sort of convenient, especially with the electricity going around him. Very lucky overall. As I had mentioned earlier, you can actually have it so that way your body, if it's underneath Bokushi, can just be fighting out in the background, surprisingly. And
yeah, I don't understand why they chose to do that. Like, it makes no sense.
I'm not too certain either, but it's probably because the boss can't exist on the space that your body is already occupying when it's on the ground, so maybe
that makes sense.
it just like auto chooses that it's running around or something, and you have to wait for the fight to end. It is worth mentioning he's making use of slow-mo there to make sure some of these attacks end up hitting Bokushi more effectively, although it might be working against him there in extending how long that attack actually lasts. One of the perks of slow-mowing is exactly that, in that you can slow down a boss's or enemies' attack animations. However, in certain cases you actually want those animations to be going as fast as possible, so that way phases transition and cutscenes happen a little bit faster than they otherwise would.
Do you know what causes Bokushi to do the attacks versus just the suction dying animation?
I'm actually not quite certain, because in at least my experience when going into that final sort of death throes, sometimes what I do is just slow-mo and throw a damage glitch as soon as he starts to sort of choose an attack to do.
Mm-hmm.
And most times he would actually just do the vacuum, but in other times he would actually just choose an attack. So it's really sort of timing dependent, in my opinion, because being able to sort of, I guess, finish off the boss as you've already finished him off is sort of I don't know, sort of an art, because nobody really knows how that fight actually is supposed to end.
Yeah, it's somewhat counterintuitive just when you reach the threshold and then the boss just does an additional attack, you know?
Yeah, or sometimes multiple attacks as well. Like, sometimes Bokushi can just decide to do multiple attacks. Even though you've thrown a good amount of damage glitches into him, he just chooses different attacks all the time. Really sort of a strange boss fight there, but Dale making good work of these fighters by Pascal's fence there. He did get a little bit caught up there in terms of some of the enemies. When it looks like he lost lock on core 2, so he's going to have a little bit of difficulty throwing those damage glitches as the core wildly runs around there. He does have to be careful on where that core gets placed as it drops down, but overall still pretty good. He does have his buffs up, so he should be able to get it there. Nice. Overall, still a respectable kill on core 2. He's going to make his way out to Eve in the final fight.
It's Eve. It's gotta be.
If we destroy this presiding unit,
He does need to be careful on some of these fights. He did end up picking up his resilience chip from Bokushi, so that should give him a good advantage over Eve in this fight here. Definitely being able to not stagger on this final fight is super, super nice, especially on some of the later phases, as we had seen, where Eve goes into a sort of ranged attack phase. It's very convenient in not staggering on some of these hits, because we definitely want to be making sure our damage output is as high as possible, and we're definitely going to need that for this first opening phase here. And Dale just skirting by the threshold for platforms here. Overall, still pretty good. Skipping that phase entirely is a huge time save and very convenient, because nobody likes that platforming section that Eve does. It's completely unnecessary and completely a little sort of silly to do, especially in the speedrun itself. Those platforms are not really what we want to be doing at all. So really just damaging down the boss here is our best option. Still relatively good DPS from Dale here. Backdashing there on each of these damage glitches is going to cost him a good amount of damage and time. But overall, still pretty good 2 phases from Dale on this first half of the fight. Going into phase 3 here, he does have to really make sure that his buffs are up here, because if he isn't careful, Eve can really make a number on him.
So when you're doing damage glitch, you do have some invincibility frames, right? Like when you're going forward and throwing the sword out.
Yeah, you do have a little bit, but you don't have too many. It is sort of a skill and technique to master. I don't particularly time them conveniently with when an enemy is supposed to be attacking. However, for the more skilled among us who can actually time their damage glitches with those specific attacks, definitely take good advantage of those iframes.
It is pretty tough. I tried to do that right in the beginning of Eve 1, but like the windows are really tight.
I find it most common in something, or in some of the more simplistic fights, like negotiations, where you're really sort of locked in a 2D perspective, and you don't really have to worry about positioning all that well. Wow, Eve being very nice here to DaleDukk, not moving around at all in that final phase. Just constantly throwing those attacks is definitely what we wanted out of Eve on that final phase, because 2B is slowly walking around the map. Definitely lucky in terms of DaleDukk's RNG. They're very nice. Close the fight and to close out the run at that. 153.48 on the dot. Very nice. We'll see if we can get Dale in here as well. for a little bit of a post-run talk. I don't believe there's anything after our time slot tonight. I believe I had checked the schedule beforehand, so we do have a good amount of time after. But overall, still
ouch.
Good performance from these two runners here tonight. That was an interesting experience, Dale, in your early game. I'm really sorry that happened.
Yeah, it's one of those. My method for that, I want to learn Voidless, but I've kind of been putting it off because I didn't want to learn new stuff and then mess it up mid-run and have that happen. So my method is wing it, and I thought that entire platform there is solid. So, you know, you learn something new every day, and can't be too mad about it because now I know not to go to the left side of that platform.
Yeah, some of the geometry in this game is sort of weird, as we had seen. Some of the out of bounds just don't really want to have any sort of sense or logic to them. But it's really sort of unfortunate having fallen into that pit, because I would have probably have seen, like, there of course are ways to get outside of that pit and back up onto the platform that you need, and there's also other ways outside of that pit itself in terms of just sort of scaling the walls. Having that knowledge definitely helps in sort of recovering from it.
Yeah, and it's another one of those things, I just need to go back and look at it now. I mean, it's all about learning and getting better, and I can't be too mad, because you make a mistake and you learn from it.
Yeah, sure.
I did know there was a backup there, but I didn't know it, and I thought, okay, I'll just load, do it the normal way. And I would have gone for it again, but, you know, nerves, so...
True.
Took the casual way.
But overall, pretty nice runs out of both of you. How did you feel, Dale, when you, towards the very end, they're dying on Bokushi? Another sort of mishap.
Not too happy, obviously. I mean, I definitely already knew I was gonna sub 2 unless that happened again. So, and sub 2 is usually the goal for my runs. So I guess I wasn't too terribly bothered by it. But the fact that it was right at the end, and the fact that the ball usually dies before then, I didn't know why that happened.
Yeah, that's a pretty common thing. I've died exactly that same way a few times in the last couple months. It happens.
It's always so silly when it happens, but it basically happens to everybody. Because Bokushi is sort of an interesting fight in that regard, his final attacks that he throws out can really sort of be random and volatile. So you don't really know what he's going to give you until he finally just sort of spits out the attacks at you. But again, overall, still pretty good runs out of both of these guys tonight. If you guys have anything else to point out?
I was really happy that I got like that bridge swag. That's pretty much it. Such a cool strat.
I mean, this is going to be my last race for the tournament because I'm 0-3, which is about what I expected, but I just want to say all the runners that I've raced so far have been really great. All the commentators have been really great. The hosts have been great. Really awesome tournaments so far. Looking forward to seeing the top 16 when that finally happens. There's going to be a lot of close races and whatnot. Probably just the top 16 leaderboard runners, I think. Yeah, it's just been really cool so far, and learning the run has been awesome. Community's awesome. It's the only like large speedrunning community I'm a part of, and honestly, I couldn't ask for a better one. All of you guys are awesome. Also, no pipe, best pipe.
We might have some problems there.
Yeah, I don't think we can be friends anymore.
Oh no.
But yeah, thanks a lot, Ethereum, for commentating.
Yeah, no problem.
And thanks for the race deal.
Yeah, thanks. Both of you.
Thank you guys for racing. So for those of you who are new to watching this tournament, we, the speedrunning community for NieR Automata, have been running a round robin for the past couple of weeks among 32 players. I believe the commands !NA in chat bring up the schedule for our bracket, and at least in a couple weeks time or so, we will be organizing more of these races, going head to head against more of the top 16 runners of the 32 that we have organized in this tournament. Again, thank you to the runners as well tonight. Definitely check out their streams. I believe we will be... I don't remember when exactly the next match up is scheduled. I believe that's tomorrow.
I have one at 1 o'clock Eastern tomorrow versus Unity.
Indeed we do. So I think with that we'll sign off. Thank you Speed Gaming for hosting this. So thank you to them and all the guys working behind the scenes at Speed Gaming. Thank you, thank you. And with that, I've been your host, Ethereum. Have a good night, everybody.